Good evening and welcome to Stones and Thrones. My name is Nicholas A. Venna, and this is my show. I analyze and talk about current events in society, culture, and political news in pursuit of the good things to which we can hold fast and build upon, stone by stone, until myself and like-minded individuals have thrones at last. Occasionally, I'll be responding to stones that are thrown at me, and sometimes I'll be throwing some stones of my own. Tonight's topics are the Great Monarch, prophecy, Catholic prophecy in particular, and the relevance of these things to the state of politics today as they are in these United States of America. Before I jump into that, there's a little bit of background, and I can't get too elaborative on all of these things because there's got to be some presumed knowledge about the stories that I'm referencing and the statements that are made in them. So if you're not aware of some of the things that I'm talking about, you might just have to look them up. I'll try to provide some guidance or cite the things that I'm referencing, but generally speaking, I'm assuming that for the most part, you're familiar. So for starters, as a Catholic, whether or not you're aware, you ought to be, that Catholics still believe in prophecy. It is a part of the church as it is today. It did not disappear or die with the Old Testament. And the role of prophecy in the church today is to guide the church along in its journey here through time. And one of the fundamental roles of the prophet, which is one of the gifts talked about in the New Testament, the gift of prophecy, one of the roles of the prophet is not, as a lot of people assume with the name, future telling, but actually announcing and denouncing. So the fundamental role of the prophet is to maintain and nurture a spiritual connection with God for a heightened, purified, and divinized sense of the state of things in the world, the state of the church, the state of souls in general, and to be able to provide guidance to the body of believers in a general sense regarding the disposition of God towards the general disposition of humanity, in particular the church, broadly speaking, who is the bride of Christ. A lot of people don't consider the significance of that concept when it comes to politics, least of all the particular politics of any given nation. But as it stands, they are extremely relevant, the prophets and their prophecies and the things that they say, to things like politics, and especially in our case, in the United States of America, because of the general role of the United States in global politics and global policy and society across the globe. So it is relevant, it is important, it's something to consider, and it's something that Catholics should be aware of. But in extremely broad strokes, without getting into the details or in any way trying to justify the statements that I'm making, for which there is ample evidence and documentation and a longstanding history to support these assertions, that would be on you to look up. But as a Catholic, what we would be looking forward to in this state of human history is a great monarch and an angelic pope, and a partnership between these two, where part of the role of the angelic pope is in the form of prophecy of, in a way, validating, verifying, and ratifying the importance and the authenticity of this great monarch. And the role of this great monarch is in the political realm, in the world, as a kingdom, and as a nation. This individual has often been referred to as the great French monarch because of the mystics, which is a very distinct thing from a prophet. The mystics have often referenced a great French monarch. So whether or not this is an individual who would spring up from France, or this is an individual who would have some sort of bloodline connection to the dignitaries or nobility of France, especially, I'm not going to say ancient France, but definitely Middle-Age France, like akin to what Charlemagne was, I believe, in the 7th or 8th century, where he performed a unifying role in the known world at the time in his battles against the Turks or the Mohammedans, or what we know today as Islam. So this individual plays a significant role and ushers in what we understand as the 6th epoch or epoch of the church. Right now, us being in the very late portions of the 5th epoch, which the prophets and mystics have both indicated began roughly around the time of the Protestant Reformation and the Antichrist, Martin Luther. So just over 500 years ago. Now, as a Catholic, we also have a considerable and significant prophetic mark a little over 100 years ago, almost 400 years to the day, certainly the very month of what was going on in the Protestant Reformation of Germany in 1517 with the posting of the 95 Theses. In 1917, in Fatima, Portugal, during World War I, just about a year shy of the end of World War I, the Spanish flu that was about to erupt and take more lives than the war itself, there were 3 children, extremely famous. Pretty much everybody has heard about them if you're a Catholic. But the Fatima visionaries, these 3 children, Jacinta, Francisco, and Lucia. Jacinta Francisco, who died shortly thereafter of the Spanish flu, which was foretold by their visions with Mary, the Mother of God, the Mother of Jesus. And in Fatima in 1917, October 13th, there was the Miracle of the Sun, which was attended by as many as 70 to 100,000 people who all witnessed a miracle of the dancing sun spinning like a disc on its axis, eventually, dancing across the sky and eventually hurling itself towards the earth, at which point people started crying out and begging God for mercy, even shouting out their sins, doing public confessions and whatnot. And then what seemed like an inevitable doom was abated when the sun returned to its place in the sky. And then there were several rotating visions that many of the people had of the Holy Family, Our Lady of Mount Carmel, Saint Joseph holding the child Jesus and whatnot, and those types of things. For the most part, the visions were uniform across the better part of these 70,000 people, including a communist atheist who was there on behalf of a publication that operated in the interests of the Communist Party that was governing the area and the region at the time. Naturally, this communist published these stories and was basically verifying the miracle and the number of people there, and there was a photographer accompanying this journalist, and all of that is in the public record. You can look these things up online. You can see photos of the spectacle itself and firsthand eyewitness accounts of the things that took place, and it was considered ever since the greatest miracle ever in human history, next to the parting of the Red Sea when the Hebrew people were led out of Egypt. So an extremely significant miracle, and that took place at roughly 400 years after the Protestant Reformation, at which time there were several prophecies, including a prophecy of the end of the First World War, which did in fact take place the following year. The war was ended in 1918. There was also a prophecy that the war would start up again, in the words of the seers of 1917, So what we understand in secular society as World War II, the prophetesses and prophet of 1917 foretold would actually be a continuation of the First World War. For anybody who has visited Europe, especially Eastern Europe, by the way, and has ever interacted with people who lived in Europe and were alive or the immediate descendants of people who were alive during World War II, it's universally understood and unquestioned that World War II is a direct derivative of World War I. And without World War I, there would be no World War II. So it stands to reason that the understanding of the three Fatima seers of World War II as merely a continuation of World War I is the most practical understanding of what actually happened. And I understand roughly that the words that were spoken to these three seers was that the war would end in the following year, and that if certain conditions were not met, the war would start back up again in the reign of, and then the Pope was named, who didn't even exist at the time, during whose reign World War II started. So that's also documented, recorded history, and you can look all of that up for yourself. But an easy example of the connection between the Catholic prophets, an easy validation and ratification that Catholic prophecy does still exist, has since the inception of the church 2,000 years ago, and will persist until the end of time as a form of beacon or lighthouse or guide to the world at large, but in particular the church. So the reason I mention that, again, is because this concept of the Great Monarch. Now, the Great Monarch is a prophecy that has been foretold basically beginning as early as the first couple of centuries of the church. So St. Augustine, who lived from 354 AD to 430, so in the 5th century, talked about the Great Monarch that would be arriving near the end times. Pope Leo VI talked about it, and he lived, or at least reigned as Pope from 1914 to 1928, in that 14-year period. St. Malachi, the Black Pope, or the Caput Nigrum prophecy, which is something that came in 2001. St. Anselm of Canterbury talked about it. He lived from 1033 to 1109, so at the turn of the millennia. John of Jerusalem mentioned it. He was an individual who lived from 1042 to 1119. Bishop Christianos of Agreda, 1172 to 1204. St. Angelus of Jerusalem, 1185 to 1222. Dulcino or Dulcinus of the 14th century. Brother John of the Cleft Rock also in the 14th century. The prophecy of Orval in the 16th century, Giorgiano Varins of the 16th century, Nostradamus, not even, I guess he was Catholic, but he's not a saint, the rest are. Also talked about this in the 16th century. Rudolf Geckner in the 17th century, St. Ignatius of Santhia in the 17th and 18th centuries. The Capuchin Friar in 1776, so that's the 18th century, that's during the Revolutionary War. Here in the United States, Anne Catherine Emmerich talked about it in the 18th century. She didn't die until 1824, so into the 19th century. So I'm not going to list all of them, but you can look up all of these things. This is a prophecy that has been part of Catholic culture, Catholic prophecy, Catholic spirituality for basically the better part of 16 to 17 centuries. So it's not new, it's not novel, and it's certainly not disputed by any rational person or any reasonable Catholic who understands church history and how these things work. So the Great Monarch. I mention this because there are a number of indications that this is approximately where we are in the world today. A lot of the indicators that are talked about by these different mystics, a lot of these prophecies that are made about the state of the world and where it's headed are discussed, and the times that we're living in right now resemble them, at the very least, more closely than any other time in human history, at least in the last 2,000 years that these things have been going around, resembled them. And they coincide with an angelic pontiff. So the reason why this is important is because when you look at the state of politics today in the United States, so I'm going to be moving pretty quickly from what is at least considered very almost esoteric, although Catholics wouldn't consider it to be such a thing, but certainly something that's like very spiritual and not as tangible in the way that we understand history, in the way that we understand politics, much less than the way that we understand punditry. And I'm going to be making a connection between these two things. And so, oddly enough, this does somewhat intersect with something I've wanted to talk about for a while, which is the phenomenon of Nick Fuentes. And it is a phenomenon because there is Nick Fuentes, the person, then there's Nick Fuentes, the phenomenon. And here's the distinction. The phenomenon of Nick Fuentes does, in fact, transcend the person of Nick Fuentes. And I'll get into that. Nick has indicated himself in a number of different ways, on a number of occasions, sometimes in a lighthearted way, sometimes in an irritated way. He's reminded people he's just a person, like he's a human being. And the vast majority of what people hear him say is when he's on camera. And curated is not a word that he used, but there's an aspect of it where he has articulated that when people like him are on camera, they are always cognizant of the fact that there's a camera rolling. Part of what they do is a persona. It's a performance. It's not something that he necessarily wants to do every day. He's made that clear. There's a number of times he doesn't even show up for his own show. There are times that he expresses exasperation at having to do the show, which unironically, sometimes he's just expressing in the persona that is performing in the moment that he's expressing it, but sometimes it's actually an authentic expression of real, legitimate, sincere exasperation at having to do the show. He's also made it clear that his aspirations exceed the bounds of the show, exceeds what he's currently doing with the show, and without question exceeds the reach of the show itself. And that's all wrapped up in the person of Nick Fuentes and what he reveals about himself and what's going on in his head at any given time. But the phenomenon of Nick Fuentes is something that transcends him. The way that this sort of works out is there are now, at this point, 1 million, maybe even several million people who have a perception of who he is, who have a perception of what it is that he stands for, who have a perception of what it is that he's doing, and perceptions about why he's doing it. And they're not uniform. As many people as there are that many unique and, in varying degrees, distinct visions of who he is, what he's doing, why he's doing it, for whom is he doing it, and what's the end game. There are insights that we can glean because he's indicated himself what his end game is. And this is how I'm going to tie this in to where I started with these more distant things, less tangible things about spirituality in the church and eschatological components of the mentions and concept of this great monarch. But Nick himself has articulated that he has a political vision for the United States. He has a nationalistic affection for being American. His show, America First, is authentically born from a number of different things that are real and directly connected to the person of Nick Fuentes. I can kind of break them down based off things that he's said to at least package that somewhat and put a bow on it so we can move on. But he likes the childhood that he had. He likes America as he understood it from the perspective of the child, of himself as a child when he had it. He likes the concept of the American family that he had. There is a wholesome quality to it, a sense of identity and more or less stability and safety in it. And he observed growing up the changing dynamic of the environment that he was living in, a changing demographic, which is essentially what he ascribes the changing dynamic to in the environment that he was living in, and the changes from a broader sense in the world at large, especially in the communities surrounding him, in the world that he grew up in, that all were taking place in a very observable, measurable, and experientially impactful way. And at some point, he refined this perspective over time in a political sense of identifying the things, the events, the circumstances that were undermining something that he really loved and cherished. And the more time went on, he had a more succinct understanding of what it was that he loved and cherished and what it was that was overriding it and what it was that was undermining and diminishing his ability to enjoy life the way that he once did and the way that he would otherwise have been able to anticipate if things didn't change in such a way. So he is very focused on the political sphere. He is a very outspoken and very clear-spoken Catholic. There isn't any indication that he is anything other than a faithful and believing Catholic, which is something that he does get challenged on quite frequently. He gets challenged on how can you be Catholic and have sort of the race views that you have, which is a question that he's answered sufficiently. He's identified himself as a race realist, and there's nothing un-Catholic about that. He's identified the fact that you can look at empirical studies, you can analyze differences from one race to another, and you can actually ascribe the differences between the races to something other than a nurture in the nature versus nurture argument. There's nothing un-Catholic about that at all. He's been challenged on comments that he's made or dispositions that he has towards women. He's sufficiently responded to all of that. There are differences between men and women, and there's nothing un-Catholic about any of the differences that he has articulated. Prior to modern history, Catholics universally, and not just Catholics, pretty much everybody, but since we're talking about Catholicism, Catholics have universally, historically, always described and talk about females as the quote unquote weaker sex. And that is in a very specific regard, and it means very specific things, and it doesn't actually mean anything, objectively speaking, diminutive about women. It also doesn't actually mean anything, objectively speaking, good about men. It's an objective, dispassionate observation regarding the differences between men and women, and from the perspective of strength and weakness, women had historically been defined and described as the weaker sex. simple examples I could draw on just so that any women watching this don't crash out, which they might do anyway, but there are some reasonable women out there who don't take offense at this. Actually, Catholic women. It's almost like a form of being able to distinguish between the two, because a real Catholic wouldn't take offense at it. But St. Paul talks about in the New Testament all of his sort of worldly accomplishments, all of his admirable, I don't want to say accomplishments, just lost for the word, but it suffices. All of the admirable things that he had done, all of the admirable achievements or accomplishments, the things that he endured, the things that he survived, and he rattles off this list of things and basically identifies himself as the greatest of the apostles, and then points out that the manner in which he's speaking is very human and like foolish, but that if he was actually going to boast of anything as a spiritual man, as a man of God, he would boast of his weaknesses. So identifying himself according to his weaknesses and the fact that he could boast of those in a spiritual sense more authentically than he could or would ever boast of his natural accomplishments in a humanly sense, he actually prefers the former. So anybody who understands and has any sort of spiritual sense would recognize without any emotions that being the weaker sex is not a bad thing. All that to point out, from an objective sense, there is nothing un-Catholic about Nick Fuentes. There are a number of things that are very Catholic about him. So from the perspective of any Catholic anywhere, if you're not taking him seriously and recognizing the phenomenon of Nick Fuentes for what it is, and you're incapable of recognizing the actual person, Nick Fuentes, for who and what he is, you won't be able to grasp the broader significance of all of these things happening at the same time, and such a person being showcased at the same time. Obviously, that doesn't mean he's a saint. None of us are. And it certainly doesn't mean that he won't be a saint, but it also doesn't mean that he won't turn into something completely the opposite. He's still alive, and like everybody else, there's a long way to go. But it cannot be downplayed the significance of such a person with such a brand at such a time in human history, most of all because there's nobody else like him. I don't flinch to point out that he is the inspiration for what it is that I'm doing today and why I chose to do it publicly the way that I've been doing privately for a number of years. And more than just an inspiration, the phenomenon of Nick Fuentes is actually what led me to believe that I might, in fact, have an obligation to do it. So just a way of sort of going through that anticipated objection that people would, if they're Catholic, would be looking at this and saying you can't really connect Nick Fuentes with spiritual concepts. Nothing could be further from the truth. There are not any obvious mainstream or popular culture Catholics today who bear the marks and significance of something holy than Nick Fuentes and what it is that he represents and what it is that he's doing. Again, where it goes from here, only God knows, but as it stands right now, there are no reasonable objections to who he is and what he's doing that are not superficial. You could gripe about the things that he says sometimes, or the jokes that he makes sometimes, or the words that he uses sometimes, but in the grand scheme of things, those are superficial. And if you were the type of person who found those to be adequate to disregard him as a Catholic, then there are no public Catholics to which you could look at and admire in the way that I'm talking about. Because in the same way that we are anticipating, and now I'm tying it together, if there was a delay, I apologize. In the same way that we are anticipating as Catholics a great monarch, Nick is a unique and never before seen type of forerunner for such a thing, because of his interest, affection, and affinity for politics and for political thought, political insight, and political strategy. There simply isn't anything else or anyone else out there like him. That should actually be encouraging to people who are somewhat exhausted with the world as it exists today and would be eager to anticipate that we are entering in to a new era of human history, a new era of the world, a new era of the Catholic Church, and what it is that we're looking for. There is also that counterpart of the angelic pope, which means we should be looking for and expecting, in a sense, certain figures who emphasize and focus on the spiritual in the same way that Nick focuses on the political, still entirely Catholic. And it's not going to look like the hagiographic symbolism that we've gotten for many decades, that is in some senses the only thing we know as Catholics today. That is a very specific form of Catholic hagiography, and the way that we view people and saints with halos and hands folded and these very forlorn looks about them over and over again. It's not really going to be like that. We'd be looking at the saints of the modern times, and God could not be glorified more than in the Catholicity of a sinner, of someone who is clearly not polished and clean and perfect, but has zeal. So when Nick talks about figures like Michael Knowles, when he talks about people like Trent Horn, when he talks about people like Matt Walsh, to which he's made reasonable overtures for them to be more serious about what it is that they're doing and to take more seriously the scandal that they represent. And they do, in fact, represent scandal. Any Catholic who goes to Mass recognizes that we say in the Confiteor, what I have done and what I have failed to do. And it is true that when you have a Catholic who otherwise seems Catholic in pretty much every way, at pretty much most of the time, and has the admiration and attention and support of huge chunks of the Catholic politic, but then at the same time don't have the balls to actually really go after some of the tougher opponents and the juggernauts that are in opposition to the church, they do become the greatest enemies of the church. So now I'm not going so far as to make that blanket statement that, a Matt Walsh or a Michael Knowles or a Trent Horn or people like them are in fact the greatest enemies of the church. But what I'm saying is that the potential is in fact there, and we are rapidly approaching a time in church history, in human history, and in American history where if you don't have the balls that they've not yet manifest the possession of, you will be a scandal and are in fact an enemy of the church because of what you're standing by and what you won't speak out against, while at the same time carrying the admiration, respect, and approval of the Catholics that are following you. So there's a lot to be said there, and I've already kind of digressed in a way that I wasn't anticipating. But we should be looking for a great monarch, which is a political figure. We should be looking for an angelic pope, which is a spiritual leader. And the signs of the time says we are getting closer. Maybe even our lifetimes. I won't get into that because then that's when people really start to split apart and go from the, oh, you're either super crazy or super unholy if you're not there. From a very practical perspective, we are there. We've been there for quite some time, including the era of Fatima, which was 100 years ago. So you can't get too crazy about it because in a way that is the now, right? 100 years ago is the now that I'm referring to, but we are rapidly approaching that state. There are prophecies of St. Malachi that people have literally been watching for 700 years that have finally come to fulfillment, at least in terms that hourglass is run out. There's no sand left. That is here, that is upon us. St. John Bosco referred to these same things. Many contemporary saints have referred to them, and there are mystics that are alive today that have the approval of the church and their local bishops that are still talking about these things. And they've been ramping up. So it is real and it is happening right now. Where can I wrap this up? What I want to, and I have the sense that I haven't really covered anything at all other than background, but what I do want to do is point out that these two things are inseparable. I know what I wanted to say. In a sense, there is a bit of a black pill that we need to swallow because we already know in some regard how this turns out. Our Lady of Fatima pointed out in October of 1917, she pointed out very succinctly that she wanted Russia consecrated to her Immaculate Heart, and that if it did not take place, then there would be major problems. We are now living in those major problems because it didn't actually take place. Some popes did try and do forms of the consecration that she requested, and Sister Lucia, who was the only surviving of the three into the late 90s, maybe early 2000s, the only surviving seer of Fatima, did at some point say it was enough, but we already know that the prophecies of Fatima have been fulfilled. The war did end, like she said, in 1918. It did start back up again in the reign of Pius, Pope Pius. I don't want to misquote it. Maybe it was the 9th, 10th, 11th, or 12th. And Russia did, in fact, spread the errors of communism all over the world. In fact, part of the reason why I'm doing this now is you can see that Mayor Mamdani is a bleeding heart communist. That is exactly what he is. Back to Nick Fuentes. He is a political leader, whether or not he would accept that title, whether or not he likes that title, he is a political leader. He has identified these people as communists, and right now there isn't anything else like him to lead Catholics in that political sphere. So, in a way, he is carrying out a role which might even bother him more, although maybe not necessarily, but carrying out the role of a prophet, not as a future teller, because that's not really prophecy, that would be mysticism, but from the perspective of announcing and denouncing. A prophet tells you where you are. A prophet tells you what's good and what's not good, and he has been sounding the whistle, sounding the alarm, blowing the whistle on these things for quite some time. He is very adept at doing it, and we can see this unfolding. And that's not brand new. Like, this has been going on, obviously, for a number of decades. And communism, at least as an overt front in Russia, has, on the surface of things, abated, but not really. And in any case, regardless, it has spread throughout the world. Communism has, in fact, spread throughout the world. China, who is now a superpower, who rivals the United States, is politically communist. Russia, regardless of how it labels itself, functions as a communist. North Korea is, in fact, communist. The United States, we are socially communist. Like, that has ruled, has pervaded. It exists in both parties. The practice of atheistic communism, the morals of an atheistic communist, the lack of morals of an atheistic communist, that already exists. It's here. You can see the threads of communism within the church. People accuse Pope Leo XIV of being a communist. The spirit of communism has, in fact, spread throughout the world, and it is, in fact, an error of Russia, which was, in fact, prophesied in 1917 by Our Lady in Fatima. So it is happening, and we are here. And what she said was, Russia would spread her errors throughout the world. There would be suffering, and ultimately, her immaculate heart would triumph. Russia would convert, and Russia would glorify her. Right now, that's not actually happening. Maybe it would happen in the future. But that is where we at. That's where we are at in a political sense in global politics. It's where we're at in American politics. And we need to be looking for and doing our part to usher in this great monarch and this angelic pope. And that's where I'll kind of wrap it up, because we do have a part to play in this. And that part is, in part, political, but it's also, in part, spiritual. Indispensably, there's the spiritual component, and you see this beginning to unfold. So think about that. I sort of had the sense that I didn't get to any of the tangible, actionable things that I wanted to, but I'm just going to have to accept that I did get through the parts that I needed to, and maybe in a subsequent show will begin to flesh this out. But we are at war. There is a gender war, there is a race war, there is an ideological war, and we are looking for and anticipating and have a role to play in helping to facilitate the appearance, the arrival, and the action of a great monarch who, in a political sense, will lead the faithful in war, and an angelic pope who, in a spiritual sense, will anoint and attest to the authenticity of this monarch, who will lead the faithful in the spiritual life through this war. And that's the black pill part, which is there is a lot of suffering headed your way. So if you are all into politics, and you are all into Catholicism, and you are all into the phenomenon of Nick Fuentes, those are all good things. But you will inevitably suffer. And if you aren't already, it is coming. And there's a black pill aspect to that, but that's not a full-throated black pill, because the reality is it's necessary. In a political sense, we should be expecting, in America, huge losses. That does not absolve us of the obligation to fight as if we're going to win, and as if we expect to win, and as if we expect that winning itself is inevitable. In a broader sense, it is. In American sense, it's probably not. But that should only inform the manner in which we fight, and not in any way cause you to recoil from the fight. Any true Catholic should be ready to fight like they've never fought before, and should be following the lead of Nick Fuentes as a Catholic in a political sense, in pursuit of a Christian society that upholds and promotes and promulgates Christian morals and Christian ethics and Christian values. Thanks for watching. Have a good night and peace out. We'll catch you next time.